Hey everybody, so I hope you have enjoyed all the pink salmon fishing video content we've been putting out throughout September, and I hope you have been out catching some pink salmon on your own as well. In our previous episode, we went float fishing for pink salmon in the Vedder River, and I've been getting a lot of questions on what's our fishing setup. And so this video is exactly just that. I'm going to go through our fishing setups from the rod and reels to the terminal tackle, including floats, and what presentations that we use. Now, these pink salmon come into the Fraser River and they travel up the tributaries to spawn. Once they get into these smaller streams, they tend to school up in pretty large numbers. And if you're casting retrieving a spoon and spinner like what we do in the Fraser River, there is a tendency to foul hook a fish by accident, because if you're dragging a spoon, dragging a spinner through the school of fish, like I said, there is a very good chance that that's going to happen. So to prevent that from happening and still catching lots of fish, we choose to float fish for these fish. By float fishing, you can adjust your depth of your float and suspend your presentation a little shallower, so it's drifting over these fish instead of through the fish. And this way you're not gonna have the hook dragging through the school, like I said, and the chance of foul hooking the fish by accident is much smaller that way. So float fishing setup in the in streams is a little different than spin casting. So we wouldn't use a spin casting setup, spinning rod and reel setup, because the river is constantly moving. There's ongoing current. So what you want to do, you want your float to drift down the river smoothly. The spinning reel doesn't feed out line very smoothly, so you have to open the bail, let the line out constantly, just kind of in batches at a time. So you tend to have this tight and loose line happening as your float is drifting down. And when you do get a bite, if you have loose line, there is a very good chance that you will miss that fish. So instead, we choose to use two different setups for float fishing in rivers, and that's bait casting setup and the center pin setup. So we're going to go through each one pretty thoroughly. Now, so let's go through the bait casting setup, which is probably what most people would go with. So it is a pretty straightforward setup compared to a center pin. We tend to, well, this is all personal preference, and you can choose whatever you want, but my preference is having a low profile bait casting reel. I am a pretty small guy, so I have a pretty small hand. So a low profile bait casting reel is a little lower. It's a little easier on my hand. And some people worry about spool capacity compared to the round bait casting reels. Rest assured, these reels hold enough line for any type of fishing, river fishing that you would do, even for Chinook salmon. I've never encountered a situation where a big fish would almost spool all of the line on these reels. So definitely, it's I love using low profile bait casting reels. This particular setup was used by Nina. So this is a E6X, a G.Loomis E6X bait casting rod, drift rod. It's 10 foot long. It's rated between 10 and 20 pound test. So slightly on the heavy side. I don't believe this particular model is available anymore, but I do believe there is a 10 to 17 pound test, slightly lighter rod available. So which is pretty similar actually. So it is a 10 foot long rod as well. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, pink salmons are not very big. They tend to be around 3 to 6 pounds. The big pink salmon is probably 8 pounds or maybe 10 pounds. And then, so what, you might ask, so why are you using a rod that's rated between 10 and 20 pounds, which is slightly heavier? This is what you use for chum salmon, for Chinook salmon. The reason being that because Nina tends to be have a little problem with her arms like getting sore from fighting fish and stuff. And by going with a slightly heavier rod, it cuts down the fight time. She finds it a little easier to handle the fish with this rod. And the E6X rods are pretty light rods, so she's not really compromising by the weight as well. It's pretty light. It's easy for her to cast. Yet it's strong enough to bring the fish pretty quickly. So that's why we tend to go with the 10 to 20 pound model. You can go down to like an 8 to 12 pound. That's kind of like the ideal pink and coho salmon rod. But if you have to buy just one particular rod for all of the fishing, because I know not everyone can have several different rods, the 10 to 17 pound, 10 to 20 pound range bait casting rods is not a bad idea, because then you can target pretty much all of the salmon species and steelhead with this particular model. Now, this bait casting reel is a Shimano Tranx 300. I've talked about this reel in many videos because I absolutely love it. It is a slightly bigger bait casting reel compared to the other Shimano models. So it's bigger than the Corrado. It holds a little bit more line. So this is what I usually use for Chinook salmon, for big steelhead, for chum salmon. And it is a very powerful reel with a pretty high gear ratio. So it's, again, this allows her to bring the fish pretty easily. And yeah, just it's a much more enjoyable experience for her. So this is a centerpin rod and reel setup. So as you can see, it's very different to the bait casting rod. A lot of British Columbia river anglers will go with this particular setup. So this is an Islander steelheader centerpin reel. It has a 1-to-1 ratio. So how much you turn, it's how much line you would gain and feed out from this reel. So why a centerpin reel instead of bait casting reel? Because it is pretty fun. You get that. The fight of the fish, it's a lot more hands-on. It provides a much smoother drift when it comes to float, because these reels, look how fast, how smooth it spins. It just goes on forever. They're beautifully designed, and these are the steelhead centerpin reels. They last forever. They simply do not break down. The components inside it's very simple. You can take it apart. You can maintain them pretty easily. So this, when the line is going out, it feeds the line out very smoothly with the current, and so it allows the float to drift down the river very naturally. So, and when you're fighting these fish, you just got to be careful. Watch your knuckles. Make sure it doesn't get hit when the fish is running. It is very fun. It is a little more challenging to cast with this reel, but it is not impossible. Anyone can learn it, and just takes some time. Okay, so to go with a centerpin reel, you need a centerpin rod, or you need a mooching rod, which can be used as a centerpin rod. This is a Shimano Technium. I've featured the Shimano Technium bait casting rod already. This is actually exact same spec as the bait casting rod. It's 10.5 feet long. It has the 12 to 20 pound rating. The only difference is, unlike the bait casting rod, it has a much shorter bottom section. This is very typical design for a centerpin setup. It's a much shorter section instead of like a bait casting rod, which has a much longer bottom section right here. So this particular rod is actually designed as a mooching rod, as a trolling rod in the ocean. You can put on the mooching reel, which is like a centerpin reel as well, but it has an actual drag system to use. So if you could use the same rod for trolling in the ocean, but also drifting in rivers. And so it's kind of like you have one rod for two purposes. Again, this is a slightly heavier rod, so it's 12 to 20 pound rating, and it's, you know, like I say, you can go down to 8 to 12 pounds, 6 to 12 pounds, which can still handle pink salmon. But for this particular day, we want to go with something a little heavier, just so we could bring the fishing a lot faster than usual. This rod would be very ideal for Chinook salmon, for chum salmon as well. For big coho salmon and steelhead, you can use this rod pretty well. So on that particular day when I was fishing during the episode, it was actually my first time using this particular model, and I was very, very happy with it. I have no complaints, and I actually really enjoyed fighting those pink salmon. Even though those fish were only about 4 or 5 pounds, they actually fought pretty well on these rods. For the main line on both reels, what I like to go with is 15-pound monofilament. So I use 15-pound Maxima Ultra Ring. I hear a lot of people do use 20-pound test Power Pro braided line as well. I haven't tried that yet, but I've heard very, very good reviews, from very good feedbacks from other people using it. So I may try that in the future. But this is something that I've been using for the last 20 years. So, you know, it's worked pretty well. So that's why I haven't really changed it at all. So, okay, so one thing about the centerpin reel, before you put on your main line or your monofilament, you kind of want to start with some backing on the bottom. So put quite a bit of backing, braided line backing on the very bottom, just to fill it up, and then you can have your mono at the very top, because it is a pretty big spool. If you start filling up with your mono from the bottom, that's the line you will never use forever basically. So for me, I only use the first maybe like 100 feet of line, which you change, 150 feet of line you change, you know, once every year or something like that. So yeah. Okay, so let's talk about floats. Okay, so floats, I've been using these D&E teardrop floats for quite a while now. So these are D&E 20-gram foam floats. There are quite a few different float products out there you can get, but these are great because they are cheap. So they retail roughly around $2 to $2.50 each, and so, you know, you can get floats up to $8, you know, at the store now, which is, I think it's really, really pricey for a float, but for $2 each, you can't go wrong with these, and they work very, very well. These are great, but they do come in other colors, the other bottom colors as well. They come in black, they come in green, they come in white, but my preference is green, and they have a very bright orange top. So when you drift this float down, the water is going to be sitting at the yellow line over here, and only the orange part is exposed at the very top. And when the fish bites, it's going to pull the float down, and that orange part disappears, and that's when you set the hook. So that's the basic concept of float fishing. And to make this float stand up like that, to sit on the water like that, you need a certain amount of weight to balance it. So I use a sliding weight. You can use pencil lead. You can use a fixed weight, but I personally like to use a sliding weight that goes up the main line. So let's take a look at this. So we have our main line right here, and we have the float. Okay, so going back one step, before you put the float on, you do need to have float stoppers on the line. So there's float stoppers at the very top of the float. So this stops the float from going further up the line. And I like to put float stoppers on the bottom of the below the float as well. So that kind of fixes the float at one position. It doesn't really move anywhere. If you don't have any float stoppers there, that float will just go up the line forever, and it just simply would not work. So you gotta have float stoppers. So coming down from the float, I use sliding weights. So I got my sliding weight right here, and I thread this on. You want to use a large enough weight so that so you will sink the float until the water surface line reaches the yellow line. If the weight is too small, the float's gonna be sitting like up here, that's where the water is going to be. If the weight is too heavy, this float is going to be completely submerged, and that does no good for anyone, because then you wouldn't be able to feel the bites. This will just keep sinking down until the bottom. It's just no good. So pick, it might take some experimenting, so pick the right size weight to add to your line. So sliding weight goes onto the line. Some people use split shots as well. I personally don't like split shots. So once the sliding weight is on, I put a bead on there, and then I put a swivel onto the main line as well. So that float setup is complete, and it just comes down to what presentation you want at the end of your line. For the swivel that's attached to the main line on one end, on the other end, you're gonna tie a leader to it. And again, I use Seagull fluorocarbon. So this is 12-pound test Seagull fluorocarbon. You can go down to 10. You know what? Actually, for that particular day, we did use 10. So 10-pound is probably ideal. You don't want to go too light as well, because the fluorocarbon line, it is pretty thin, and you don't want any. Where we fish, there's quite a bit of snags in the area, and I didn't want any abrasion on my line as I drift down throughout the day. So you want to tie a section of the leader to this line. So we're going to tie just like an improved clinch knot. This leader right here, I tend to keep it pretty short. 2 feet is kind of like the maximum length you want. I tend to go down to 1.5 foot long. If your leader, some people think your leader should be very, very long, so that way you would the weight wouldn't spook the fish. Trust me, that weight does not spook the fish. So go down to 2 feet. Okay. If your leader is too long, a lot of times, depending on what you put on the end of the line, if it's something that's quite buoyant, like for example bait or a piece of wool, it has a tendency to get carried up by the current if it's too long. So then what happens is it's the current that's lifting the float up, lifting the hook up away from the fish, and that way you actually don't end up getting many bites. For this particular trip, fishing for pink salmon, we have a variety of items that we used. You can use a little jig head like that. So these are some of my favorite jig heads right now. So what I didn't mention was that I've been using these during the last steelhead fishing season. So these are made by Jig Geek again. These are 1/16 ounce jig heads with a 1/0 size 1/0 hook on it. So if you go out and try to find jig heads this small, they tend to come with a much smaller hook, and the hook tend to be very, very thin and very easy to bend. But these 1/0 hook are very, very tough. They're very solid, so you can barely bend it. And I love using these jig heads. So you tie these onto the end of the line. What you can do, you can put a little pink curly tail to it. So just put that on. For some reason, we didn't get many bites on this particular setup with the curly tail. But in the past, trust me, like I've had caught many pinks using this. I think that particular day the current wasn't very strong, so it wasn't giving the tail a lot of action as it drifts down the river. But this actually works really, really well for pink salmon. It doesn't necessarily have to be pink for pinks. You can use chartreuse, not green, and you can use other colors. They do work as well. I personally think it's more the action of the lure than the color. The color does play a factor. I think it more depends on the water clarity and the lighting. You kind of want to choose your color based on that. I don't think the fish has a preference on what color they love to bite onto on that particular day. It's more what color stands out in the water and that the fish can actually see it. So definitely play around with the color based on the water coloration and also the lighting of the day. That way it does have a tendency to give you more bites or less bites depending on what colors you're using. So the other thing that we used to catch fish that day was we used these tiny little spoons. So these are little trolling spoons for trout in lakes, and there's a variety of options out there for you to get at stores. There's little shavers, there's dig knights, there's the Gibbs gypsies as well. So many different ones. They're very, very thin, so they weigh pretty much nothing actually. So okay, so one thing to note is that these trout spoons come with trout hooks when you buy them at the store. So you do need to change your hook so that, because the trout hooks can't really handle salmon that well. I like to change them to size 1 or size 1/0 salmon hooks, but not the so the owner, what I usually like to use, right back, what I usually like to use for salmon in freshwater are these owner SSW needle point hooks. This is what I use to bait my roll onto them, but I don't want to use these to, I mean you can, but I don't want to use those ones to put on the trout spoons. What I like to use instead are these SSW straight eyes. So these straight eyes are completely straight, so that it's almost like a typical hook for lures that you use, except it's quite a bit shorter. So I would take the hook off the lure when it comes out from the package, and you would throw this on like so. So that hook is kind of like it goes straight up and down instead of bending like that way, which the other hooks would do. So yeah, so the owner SSW straight eye hooks is what you want. This hook is still barbed, but you gotta pinch the barb down. When you're fishing in any of our rivers, streams, sloughs in BC, you need to have a barbless, single point barbless hook. That's what you need to have. So this can be tied onto the end of your leader. Again, the leader is about 2 feet long, maybe a little shorter, tied onto there. So then you can drift this down the river. So you have your weight, you have your spoon, it's drifting down. Let it drift down freely. So it's gonna float it down based on the current like that. Looks like a little bait fish, looks like a little salmon fry. You can put a little tension on your reel so the line doesn't go out as fast. So that pulls the float back a little bit, and that gives the lure a little more action on it, when there's a little more resistance against the current. I find that most of my bites were actually coming from when I put on that bit of resistance on the line, so that the spoon, it kind of will, instead of fluttering down freely like that, it will start going that way and start spinning like that, almost like a fish trying to swim upstream, and that kind of triggered a lot of bites that day. So tiny little spoons. You can use little trout beads, like we have a pink bead right here. You can use beads, you can use wool, something that's colored. Pink salmon are not very hard to catch, but as you can see in our previous video, we did miss quite a few bites, and there was a period at the very beginning where we didn't get many bites as well. Conditions do matter as well. So in that clear low water conditions, the fish were pretty spooked. Even though they're pink salmon, they do get pretty tense up as well, and that means that you wouldn't get as many bites. So definitely be patient. Just keep drifting. Don't make your float depth too deeper when you're not getting bites, because you just end up foul hooking fish, which is not very fun. Keep drifting above the fish over and over again, and eventually one fish will be will let the guard down and start biting it. So there you have it. So that's my float fishing setup for pink salmon. Oh yeah, so this particular setup can be used for chum salmon as well. It works very well in November for chum salmon. So yeah, so even though our pink salmon fishing season is coming to an end in about 10 days from now, we got chum salmon coming up. You can use this for steelhead. So what I like to mention is that for the jig head that I tied on here, I like to thread on a piece of shrimp on here, and the shrimp can actually stay on here very well, because the hook it's very stiff. It's pretty long, so that shrimp will stay there on there quite nicely, and it works very well for steelhead. I'll do another video on that a little later on when steelhead fishing season starts. Okay, so if you have enjoyed this video tutorial, I guess, please hit that subscribe button. It'll really help this channel to grow. I really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions regarding these setups or any other fishing questions, be sure to leave it in the comment section. I'm always doing my best to answer all your questions. So definitely, there are no dumb questions. So just ask them and I'll answer them. And like this video if you enjoyed it. And yeah, until next time, good luck fishing.
Yes, fish on. Finally.
It took a while to catch a pink salmon.